Whenever we lurk, we would all like to imagine ourselves as this mastermind who is going to single-handedly win the round by killing all of the rotators and clutching up. But let's be honest with ourselves. Most of the time, we look like this.
Oh, fuck.
Why would you check that
Look
now?
at save, look at save, look at save, look at...
The role of the lurker is probably the strangest role in Counter-Strike, as not only do you have to have sharp game sense, but it's also the role that is most reliant on how the enemy responds, apart from IGL. But such is the way of lurking, and today, we'll be exploring how to be more effective at being a lurker. Having a good lurker is one of the most useful assets to a team. If your team's strats all depend on 5-man site takes with the occasional fake, it becomes incredibly predictable and very easy to counter-strat. However, throw in one person to kill off any CT rotators and get picks from across the map, and the CT counter-strats are disrupted. A good lurker knows exactly how to cause the most amount of chaos within the defense, trying to bait the enemy team to either over-respond and rotate to help prevent a problem that no longer exists, or to make the enemy think that they called the lurker's bluff before the other side of the map is actually attacked by multiple players. Thus, the lurker contributes to their team by throwing the enemies into disarray. However, you cannot always lurk. Counter-Strike does not have hard set roles, and every player can choose what they want to play no matter the situation. But if you want to be the most effective player, you have to make the most out of your opportunities and switch roles from time to time. Lurkers definitely switch out of their main role the most, as their playstyle is heavily dependent on the enemy's rotations and counter strats. Sometimes, the enemy simply will just not adapt to you and you'll get the easiest frags of your life, but other times, they are out for blood. Lurking is more of a side role than a dedicated role, since there are many rounds where you'll have to stop lurking in order to keep the enemies on their toes. When you think of the best lurkers in professional Counter-Strike, such as FaZe's ropz, former Nip's Get Right, and Astralis' blamef, you will often see them serving other roles in a push, because the opponents will just counter them if they go for a lurk. They are certainly known for the huge highlights that are generated from a lurk playstyle, but at the highest tier of competition, they can't expect their opponents to keep allowing them to go for the same strategy. So even though we would like to think of these players as permanent lurkers based on their highlights, they occasionally have to switch to a different position in order to keep providing more tangible value for their team. However, even if they don't lurk, they are providing a lot of intangible value. The enemies know that these are top tier lurkers, so they have to be constantly aware of an attack from behind, even when none is coming, which is a huge asset to a push when the enemies cannot focus 100% of their resources on an imminent site hit. This is why it is incredibly important to be unpredictable as a lurker, so if you want to learn how to be a lurker and optimize your disruption of the enemy team, join me as we learn how to play Counter-Strike's sneakiest role. As I mentioned, a lot of what you are working towards as a lurker is being more unpredictable, which means you need to be incredibly versatile in any situation. Knowing how to play around the enemy's utility, especially smoke grenades and mollies, are basic fundamentals that you will have to learn. This dynamic between the lurker and smokes is going to fundamentally change in CS2, so I'm going to make a video on that way later, but for now, let's talk about the rest of the skills that you will need to learn in order to be an effective lurker, which luckily or unluckily for you, is mostly based on game sense rather than mechanics. You will need to learn the basics of map control, timings, and positioning. Let's start with map control. In Counter-Strike, the Ts and CTs are fighting for space on the map. Let's take a B rush on Dust 2 for example. The standard CT meta for Dust 2 is usually 3 long, 1 mid, and 1 B, and they generally control this space highlighted in blue since the long players are contesting long, the mid player is looking downcast so the Ts can't be on A, and the B player has control of B, but not tons because he's playing passively. The 5 Ts, on the other hand, only have control of upper tons in this example, and as they rush, the 2 CTs will try to stall the Ts, making B site the point of contention in this round, which is determined on what happens in this 5v2 on the initial contact and the subsequent retake. However, what if we put a lurker lower tons? Suddenly, as the rest of the 4 Ts attack B, the lurker sneaks up mid and surprises one rotator, then slips back before he gets traded. The situation looks way less favorable for the CTs, but this is a very watered down example. CT strats end up being far more complicated than that. For example, who has map control here? Who has map control here? And that's also assuming we perfectly know what the CT setup and rotations are. What if they play 2 long, 2 mid, and 1 B? Suddenly, the mid lurk himself gets caught off guard by one of the players mid who stayed to watch for the lower tons rotation. Understanding at which points the CTs have which areas of the map covered at certain points takes a lot of game sense or a few rounds to understand the strengths and weaknesses in the CT's defense. But you also have to understand their tendencies towards aggressive CT plays. Do the CTs like to push lower at the beginning of the round, or do they try to do a stack on cat for lower tons info? Strats like these are what you really want to look out for as a lurker, as it will help you plan for more effective routing. It's also very important that you look at how the CTs rotate, as these are the moments that the CTs are going to let their guard down the most, and oftentimes the biggest opportunities for the lurker to get an easy pick. This segues into the next topic perfectly, which is mastering timings. Understanding when the enemy rotates, goes back to check another position, or when they throw nades, will help you lurk, as they are openings that you need to not only figure out within a given game, but also know how to take advantage of. But an underrated aspect of timing is knowing when your opponents are going to zone out while holding an angle. We've all experienced it before. We hold an angle for half the round and no one appears, yet the moment we check the minimap, they magically peek and kill us. Sometimes this is just a coincidence, but if you want to try to time your opponents more often, you have to know certain tricks to make it more likely. The easiest way to timing someone is to know which areas and when people tend to drop their guard or zone out. The most consistent timing that you can get is catching rotators, since they are more focused on assisting with the sight hit than on a potential flank. But you can also catch people trying to check other angles if your teammates show presence. The key is to try to learn when players tend to go from one task to another, and that is the best opportunity to catch them off guard and hopefully get out without getting traded. You can obviously try to kill them when they are looking away from you, but if we really want to optimize our gunfights, we could try to wait for the opponents to pull out a nade or maybe unscope as an offer. For example, if you're lurking lawn on dust 2, you can wait for your teammate's cat to push, and oftentimes, the CT ramp or site will pull out a molly or a nade to try to slow them down. This is an even better time to peek now, since the enemy has even less of a chance to kill you at all. Now, it may just sound like you're just baiting your whole team, but there's a lot of value in being first contact as a lurker. Here we can see Stewie2k is not necessarily lurking, but the rest of Liquid is going mid to B. Stewie tosses down a lurk smoke to cause even more confusion for Astralis, as it conceals the number of people who are mid and B, as well as giving Astralis a false sense of security that no one will push the smoke, but of course, it's Stewie2k. However, what I want to draw attention to is when Stewie decides to make contact. He first jumps onto the box when Elige's window to hopefully get a pick on someone who isn't paying attention. However, Glaive is ready for his peek, but misses. But because of Stewie's distraction, Elige just rushes through window and kills Glaive easily, and as Magisk and Elige fight, Stewie fully commits and kills Magisk as he isn't even looking at him. If you can learn the habits and timings of your opponents, it opens so many more opportunities for you as a lurker. But to tie it all together, lurkers are nothing without good positioning and posting. Lurkers often don't move around a lot, which makes where you hide and post up extremely important. Some spots are far more predictable than others, and some spots are more exposed than others. A general rule of thumb is that the safer the spot is, the more predictable of a lurk spot it's going to be. For example, if we take a look at the corner between mid doors and lower tons, you are protected from all angles except top mid, and you can watch cat in mid doors. Despite this is a bad lurk spot since it's completely predictable and has been used since the dawn of time. But if you sit behind Xbox, you'll be exposed from not only top mid, but you can't watch cat effectively, and a lower tons push could easily kill you without a chance of your teammates trading. But it is far less likely that a mid player will check for you if they are retaking B. There are strengths and weaknesses to each position, but you generally do not want to use the same hiding spots more than a few times during a game. Yet, we can utilize our previous hiding spots to create new angles that the enemies won't expect. A common tactic that you could use is to go to the opposite angle from one that you already successfully hid in. When the enemies need to rotate, they will naturally check the angle that you were previously in, which gives you an easy shot to the back of their head. But it doesn't have to be opposite to where you were hiding. It could be behind cover where you peek upon hearing the enemies check the original angle, or even an angle further up the path where enemies will drop their guard after clearing the first angle. However, you will provide your team with limited value if you just keep hiding and waiting for your opponents to peek. You need to pick positions that you can post up and guard an angle that the CTs will rotate from. The most common form of posting up is to sit at an angle where CTs might push up aggressively to rotate, such as posting up on upper tons on this pillar. There are a lot of examples of this throughout the map, but the fundamental principle of a good post-up spot is that you need to not only have cover and be unpredictable, but you also need to be able to rotate quickly to your team if they need help. posting up doesn't always pan out. Sometimes the enemies won't push or they adapt to your positioning, which obviously isn't ideal since you're not doing much else. So the least you could do is to be in position to aid your teammates as much as possible. Using this upper ton spot, you could easily rotate to CT mid and try to get a pick mid like a Giga Chad, but more likely you could get a lot of value by taking cat and applying some pressure A site. And that is half the game of playing Lurker, which is trying to find value in case the enemy team is actively trying to shut you down. Lurkers often get targeted since they are isolated from the rest of the team, meaning they are far less likely to get traded out, and the fact that a few ratty plays will certainly tilt the enemy team. I've touched on it earlier, but it is very important to understand role swaps if you want to be an effective lurker. Ideally, I would advise against entry fragging or opping unless absolutely necessary, since part of a lurker's value is the fact that enemies are unsure whether or not they will be attacked from an unknown angle if the lurker is alive, and entry fragging and opping have a high tendency to get the first pick, which directly tells the enemies that you aren't lurking. I also think IGLing is quite difficult for most lurkers since you have to try to manage your team from across the map, but then again, blamef is the IGL for Astralis. So in a perfect world where your team allows you to play whatever you want with all other roles filled, I would suggest playing support as a designated flank watcher, but realistically, you will probably need to fill a lot of roles depending on what your teammates play, what the situation calls for, your spawn location, etc. Considering that you are just joining in on your team after they found some sort of pattern with only 4 players, it's only really fair if you fill in. My first video in this series covers how to play support if you want to check that out. But in an ideal world, you would actually not want to go in as a second or third entry, and rather use your lurker skills to post up on the flank while throwing some utility to help out the team. This way, it's far less likely for you to die and reveal that there's no lurker, and the enemy team will constantly have to acknowledge that you could be behind them. However, since this is a naturally more baity role, you will often be the last one alive, so it's important to learn how to clutch and how to save. The essence of a good clutch player is knowing how to isolate fights, and lucky for us, if you're following your team in a site hit, your dead teammates probably gave you the info where the CTs are, so that's half the battle. To isolate players, the most important thing to do is to break up the angles either by peeking each angle methodically one by one, or by using spare utility to clear out a few angles at a time, but that's far more dangerous. After the first contact, it's just a matter of predicting where the other CTs will try to trade from. Usage of map geometry, poor CT positioning, and literally any advantage that you could get should be used considering that this is an extremely unfavorable situation, which might prompt you to save. Making sure that your team is well equipped for the next round could be more important than trying to take a high risk round. Knowing when to save, how to retrieve weapons, and how to deny weapons from CTs are all important skills that will help keep sustaining value for your team. So when should you lurk? As I mentioned probably too many times in this video, it really depends more on the enemy team, which can be problematic since that sometimes means you cannot play lurker at all. But I would recommend you play the first few rounds, especially pistol round, as info rounds. What you're going to be looking for is what kind of setup the CTs are running and potential weak points that kind of setup has. Not immediately lurking also has the added advantage that conditions your opponents to not expect a lurk, so your first lurk will be much more successful. After that, it's all about the risk versus reward of going on a lurk, but as long as you keep the fundamental principles of lurking, you will increase your chances of success. And that's all I have for you guys today. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps a channel as small as mine, and I'll see you guys very soon.